Hi, Gershom.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad we were both available on short notice. An hour and a half ago, I think neither one of us knew we were going to be doing this. We should maybe explain. After we did a dialogue about a month or so ago, you said afterwards maybe we should do one on the 40th anniversary of the Six-Day War and talk about that. After all, you wrote a book about the settler movement in the wake of that. And I said, sounds good, and then I forgot about it, and yesterday I saw some publicity about the upcoming anniversary of the beginning of the Six-Day War, which is Tuesday of this week, the day after we're taping this. And I emailed you and said, well, we could do it Monday morning, and you were off at your, I guess you spent the evening at your daughter's bat mitzvah in a festive mode, and as a result, spent an inexcusable amount of time away from your email, right? And so then I got up this morning, having not heard from you, thinking it would not happen, and at 8:15 there was an email from you. So we agreed to do it at 9, and I took a shower and combed my hair. And I know you are always meticulously groomed, so that's not a problem for you, but thanks for doing this on short notice.
Well, it's my pleasure. I know that it's in today's world, it's unacceptable not to check your email at least every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day, but sometimes we have these sort of flashbacks to the 20th century and forget to keep in constant 100% total contact with the universe at every second. So I'm glad it worked out.
So you would rank your daughter's bat mitzvah ahead of an email from Bob, then, in terms of importance. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't mean to hurt you, Bob, by saying this, but actually, yes.
Hey, it's your life, okay? Set your priorities the way you want. Well, so Tuesday is the 40th anniversary of the first day of the Six-Day War. The legacy of the war, of course, continues, and that's the reason it's worth talking about. I wanted to say something quickly about the legacy from an American point of view, and then I want to ask you, before we start talking about the war itself and the aftermath, how it's thought of in Israel today. From an American point of view, there was a New York Times article the other day about how in Gaza, and of course one legacy of the war was immediately the ongoing occupation and then the resistance to that, the Palestinian resistance. The article was about how the resistance is increasingly getting radical even relative to Hamas. That is to say, Al-Qaeda seems to be kind of making inroads in Gaza. There was an article in the Times about that, and a commentary by Daniel Levy, a former Israeli official that I'll link to as well. So from an American point of view, whenever Al-Qaeda spreads, it's worth looking into the context of that. But from an Israeli point of view, I'm wondering how the war is thought of today. It was a huge military triumph, and I'm sure a source of great pride, because a serious threat to Israeli security was overcome in pretty spectacular fashion. On the other hand, the legacy of that has become, in a way, a security problem itself. But I would assume that still, on balance, on the street in Israel, that people look back to the war as a source of pride, or what?
Well, I think that when people look at the limited 6 days of war, or the 3 weeks of crisis that led to the war, obviously there's satisfaction and even a sense of celebration looking back at the war, because victory is better than defeat. Israel felt that I think the public mood in Israel at the time of the war 40 years ago was that the country was under the threat of destruction, and 6 days after feeling that they might be wiped off the map, Israelis were celebrating a victory, and that led to a lot of euphoria, and some of that euphoria is still relived vicariously when people look back at the time of the war. But at the same time, the 6 days are long over, and the 40 years of consequences are in more immediate memory than those 6 days, and it's typical of the mixed feelings about that. That the newspapers in recent days have been filled with ads both about marking 40 years since the Six-Day War and marking 40 years of occupation, and various demonstrations by anti-occupation groups against the continuation of the occupation. So I think that's indicative of the two sides of this of the war in Israeli memory. There's the incredible excitement that followed the victory itself, and there's this very, very, very long hangover in dealing with the consequences. If the war had to be, nobody would want to go back and have the results be different. But I would say there's a lot of rethinking of what was done after the war. If the victory could have been handled in a process in a way that would have been more productive for Israel, and not left us in the situation that we are today.
Well, in that regard, do people raise the question there of whether Israel wouldn't have been better off if they had just immediately given the... I mean, nobody would... This is not the kind of thing you would have thought of at the time, of course, but if Israel had just immediately given the land back to its enemies, in effect. In other words, put it back under the control of the states whose military threat had led to the war. Was that...
Even at the time, all of the options were on the table in terms of how to deal with it. The problem with this victory is that after Israel succeeded in removing the immediate threat from the Arab armies, and after it succeeded in reopening the Straits of Tiran, which are the seaway leading to Israel's southern port of Eilat, it had essentially accomplished its strategic goals in the war, and all the conquests were beyond those goals, and they had to be assigned a purpose, and there was a great deal of disagreement on what that purpose was. Was that purpose gaining land, gaining strategic depth, gaining part of the historical Jewish homeland, or was that purpose that Israel now had bargaining chips that it could trade for peace? Even at the beginning, there were very strong voices within the Israeli political establishment that said we should offer to give all of this back in return for a real peace agreement. And that offer was more or less made to Egypt and Syria. The problem is that the most difficult ongoing legacy is the rule of the West Bank, and even today the indirect control of the Gaza Strip. And there Israelis were much more conflicted, and there were fewer people who were willing to give up that land, even though there were some people who said even then, it's essential that we strike a deal with King Hussein of Jordan to give back this land because we can't rule it.
Yeah, so can you remind us, the West Bank belonged to Jordan, right?
Right.
The part of the occupied territory that belonged to Egypt has since been given back as part of the Carter peace deal, right?
Well, there were actually two pieces that you could divide the territory taken from Egyptian control into two pieces. There was the Sinai Peninsula, which was part of sovereign Egypt and was returned down to the last centimeter in the 1979 peace deal with Egypt, brokered by Jimmy Carter. And then there was the Gaza Strip. And the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were both parts of mandatory Palestine. And in 1948, when Israel declared its independence,
But by mandatory Palestine, you mean what?
The League of Nations, following World War I, took a territory which it delineated as Palestine and assigned that to the tutelage, the temporary control of Great Britain. That was called.
And that included what is now Israel, right?
That included what is now Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. And that territory was assigned to Britain, and part of the assignment to Britain was that it was supposed to in some way develop a Jewish national home in that area. Of course, what happened in that territory was that a conflict between two national groups began to develop between the Arabs and the Jews. And finally, in 1947, exhausted both after World War II and exhausted by the rising conflict between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, Britain turned over the problem of the future of Palestine to the United Nations. The United Nations voted to partition Palestine between a Jewish and an Arab state, with a very squiggly line chopping the country up more or less according to where the population was, which areas had a majority of Jews and which areas had a majority of Arabs. And the Jewish side accepted the partition, though there were some Jewish political parties that opposed it. And the Arab leadership, both within Palestine and in the surrounding Arab states, rejected the partition. And when Israel declared its independence in May of 1948, when the mandate came to an end, the surrounding Arab countries invaded the territory of Palestine, hoping to destroy the new Jewish state. At the end of that war, Israel had actually taken some of the land that had been assigned to the Palestinian state. It reached armistice agreements, not peace agreements, but armistice agreements with the surrounding Arab countries, including Egypt and Jordan. And those armistice lines became the de facto borders of the State of Israel. Now, in principle,
the so-called pre-1967 borders.
Right, or it's also known as the Green Line, because armistice lines were marked in green on the map.
Which includes West Jerusalem, not East Jerusalem, and not the Old City, right?
Right. The original partition plan actually had assigned Jerusalem to become an international city. But the UN at that time had done nothing to enforce the partition plan, and so it collapsed. And the borders were eventually decided by war and not by the map drawn in the United Nations. In the wake of the war, in principle, it would have been possible to set up a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but the Arab parties which had taken control of that land did not allow that to take place. So
this is in the wake of the 1948 war, you mean?
Exactly. In 1949, the kingdom that had previously been known as Transjordan now controlled the West Bank, and it moved to annex the West Bank, and the kingdom's name was changed to Jordan instead of Transjordan. It was no longer the kingdom across the Jordan River because it was now on both sides of the Jordan River. So the West Bank, at least from the Jordanian point of view, became part of Jordan. In the Gaza Strip, the Egyptians never annexed the Gaza Strip. They kept it under military rule. And so between 1948 and 1967, the Gaza Strip was under Egyptian military control. But it wasn't part of Egypt proper. So when many years later, in 1979, when Israel signed a peace agreement with Egypt, Israel returned all of the land that it had captured from Egypt proper in the Six-Day War, but it continued to have its own military occupation of the Gaza Strip.
And did Egypt not even especially want Gaza? I mean, it's not an especially prized piece of land, right?
I think that the Egyptian position by 1979, it changed. I think that originally the Egyptians did hope to get the Gaza Strip back under their control. But by 1979, I think it had become pretty clear that Gaza was the booby prize. It was this very narrow strip of land. A large number of the Palestinian refugees who either fled or were expelled from Israel in Israel's War of Independence were concentrated in refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. The population was increasing at perhaps one of the fastest rates in the world. And sorry about that.
Is your
phone
camera?
In the background.
And that's a phone, good.
Yeah, and the...
I'd rather that be a phone than a camera.
No, sorry. The other line's still working here.
That's fine.
So the Egyptians in 1979 didn't make any particular effort to get this land back. In addition to that, by that time, Egypt had recognized the PLO as the legitimate negotiator for the future of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And so the Egyptians left the future of the Gaza Strip up in the air when they signed that peace agreement.
Okay, so that kind of brings us, some of that brings us past the Six-Day War. But if you want to get back to the Six-Day War, are there where do you start telling that story? I mean, I looked it up in Wikipedia the other day, and the first interesting thing is that the article has been locked down. That is to say, no further revision is allowed because it had become such a point of contention. In other words, just competing ideological camps were amending and counter-amending. So that's like on ice now, and they're trying to figure out what to do. But the other thing is, you know, as with any conflict, you can trace it back to the Roman Empire if you want. You know, where do you start telling the story of the 67 war?
Well, one could look at this from 2 points of view. One is that in the mid-60s, the Palestinian groups, particularly Fatah, got very, very tired of the fact that the Arab states weren't acting to, quote, liberate Palestine, unquote. And they began their first attacks on Israel with the specific intention of igniting a wider conflict. So there was a escalating series of border clashes between Israel and its neighbors, really from 1965 onward. But in Israel, those were regarded as skirmishes on the edge. Israel's military intelligence, for instance, did not expect any looming war in 1965 or 66, or even in early 1967. Military intelligence was still predicting that it would that at least for the next few years there was no risk of war with the Arab states. It's like the public would have been hunting for the heads of military intelligence as being complete failures because they didn't see this coming. But the border clashes were leading to higher and higher tension with Syria, and in May of 1967, this conflict really caught fire, and the Egyptians, apparently acting in solidarity with the Syrian side, marched their troops into the Sinai Peninsula. At that time, there was a UN peacekeeping force between Israel and Egypt in the Sinai. Egyptian President Nasser demanded the removal of the UN troops, and when probably to his surprise the UN agreed and pulled out those troops, he moved his troops up to the border and also closed the Straits of Tiran, leading to Eilat. And now there was a very high-tension military confrontation, and from Israel's point of view, also a casus belli in the fact that an international waterway leading to Israel had been shut. So all of a sudden, all of Israel's military reserves were called up. Other Arab states began to join the coalition with Egypt, and by early June, there were troops on massive military concentrations on all the borders. And from an American point of view, something that's very important here is that Israel was originally hoping that the United States would step in and take the lead in solving this crisis by forcing the opening of the Straits of Tiran, using diplomatic means to control the whole crisis. The Johnson administration was unable to do that. And on June 5th of 1967, Israel launched a preemptive attack against Egypt, and then when Jordan and Syria entered the conflict, it also turned its forces against Jordan and Syria. So from an Israeli perspective, even though, as you said, you could go back to the Roman Empire, you could go back to 1949, you could go back months beforehand, but it really seemed like the crisis exploded in May of 1967, that there were these 3 unexpected high-tension weeks before the war. Everybody was expecting the country to be destroyed. I think, by the way, on the Arab side, there was a lot of ecstatic hope that Israel would be destroyed. And that's also part of the reason that just as the war brought euphoria in Israel, it brought total shock on the Arab side. The Arab publics had expected that Nasser's troops were finally going to get rid of the Zionists. And instead, Nasser, who was until then the hero of the Arab world, was completely defeated. So it was a real earthquake politically, not only in Egypt but across the whole Arab world. In fact, there are many who say that the rise of Islamic extremism in the Arab world can really be dated to 1967 because Nasser's approach of secular Arab nationalism was discredited by his complete defeat in the war.
And that is one feature of the years since, right? That the opposition to Israel has acquired a more and more religious cast, going right up to like yesterday. It seems like, right? But I had not heard it traced back quite that far. But this is one idea, I guess, that the kind of, I don't know, religionization of the conflict begins with the defeat of the Arabs in 1967.
Well, there was a political vacuum created, an ideological vacuum created in the Arab world. The previous hero, Nasser, was shown to be a paper tiger. The ideology that was supposed to unite the Arab world, to expel Israel, to defeat the imperialist West, had proven to be a complete failure, and people began to look for other solutions. I would combine that with the fact that not just in the Muslim world, but throughout the world, there was a resurgence of fundamentalist religion in the 1970s in all sorts of parts of the world. So this ideology of political Islam began to rise, but in some ways it was an infection of opportunity. It entered a political arena that was empty of a strong ideology in the Arab world.
And is there there's no standard theory on the source of the rise of more radical Islam more generally in the 70s, I gather? I mean, of course, one manifestation of it in the late 70s that Americans remember is the Iranian Revolution. But there's no, I mean, this is what people like Bernard Lewis argue over, I guess, right?
Well, I think that, first of all, as I said, I think you really have to take that question out of just the context of the Arab world. There's things that are specific to the Arab or the Islamic world about the rise of political Islam. But I think one of the more fascinating questions about this is looking at the fact that the Islamic Revolution took place in Iran, and around the same time that the Christian right was becoming a political force in the United States, which was around the same time that the radical religious right, as represented by the settler movement, was becoming a very important political force within Israel. And if you look further afield, there was also a rise of Hindu nationalism in India. So you have a situation where all over the world, really, there was a religious reaction to the secular ideologies of the 20th century, and the proposal that a recast, politicized religion could provide the solutions that capitalism and communism had not provided.
It sounds like it was happening more in the. Well, no, I guess it was. Was it happening more in the capitalist world? No, well, you wouldn't say that, given the way the lines of the Cold War were drawn at that point. I mean, I was thinking, what?
Well, remember that one of the places that this came to its most violent expression at that time was in communist-ruled Afghanistan, right? With the Mujahideen rebelling against the Soviet client state in Afghanistan.
Well, yes, and America.
Perhaps the bigger division is between places like India and the United States, where this resurgence of traditional religion expressed itself as political parties within a political system, and places elsewhere, such as Iran, where it expressed itself through outright revolution.
Okay, so you have had this growing role of religion globally as well, but so in any event, so after the 6 Day War, and we covered a lot of this in discussing your book, The Accidental Empire, on the settler movement, and as you just said, there were competing theories within Israel as to what to do with the land once they had it. Does seem to me a fairly natural thing to do is kind of what they did. Hold on to it, given the fact that the threat to their security most recently, like days earlier, had been surrounding nation states whose plan was to fight a war in the conventional way across land, with tanks and things. the idea of having a buffer zone must have been attractive. But, I mean, as you said, that's only one of various ideas about why the land should be held on to. And I guess there was a confluence of them that in the end explains why the occupation persisted. But what do you? I know you wrote a piece in the American Prospect about the Six-Day War, which you emailed to me so recently that that I didn't have time to look at it minutes ago. What themes, that's clearly your kind of considered analysis of the meaning of the Six-Day War. What themes did you kind of highlighted that piece?
Well, I think that the failure to reach a decision after 1967 had extremely negative, even tragic consequences for Israel, because the longer the occupation has lasted, the worse it has been for Israel itself. It's clearly had a very, very negative effect on the Palestinians as well. But I'm making the argument that looking at it from an Israeli point of view, that the occupation has really become, I would call it a malignancy. It is eating away at Israel. The development of the settlements, which often took place through the violation or circumvention of Israeli law, has eroded the rule of law in Israel. The financial cost has been huge. The political cost has actually been huge in an unexpected way, which is that the debate about the future of the occupied territories has so overshadowed every other discussion that the normal political issues of a modern Western country, the economic questions, the social welfare questions, have all been pushed to the side. That the education system is deteriorating, that the health system is deteriorating, and that these things can't get center stage politically because we're all still debating what to do about the territories taken in 1967. Militarily, it's become a bigger and bigger drain because Israel's army is devoting so much of its attention to holding on to the territories, to policing the territories, that soldiers aren't really prepared for a real battle. And that was shown last summer when Israel's army tried to fight Hezbollah in South Lebanon, and the Hezbollah fighters were well trained, and Israeli soldiers who'd spent all their time policing roadblocks and chasing suspects in West Bank cities found that they weren't well prepared for real battle. So in a myriad of ways, this occupation has proven to be extremely costly for Israel itself. And I guess one more very obvious way is that diplomatically it's proved disastrous. Before 1967, as one of Israel's former top diplomats told me, Israel was perceived in the West as a underdog, as an embattled country, as an ally of the West, as a country whose military program was devoted to ensuring its survival. And from 1967 onward, it was perceived in much of the West, and Europe in particular, as trying to hold on to an empire. And that has hurt Israel's international relations very, very badly. In many ways, the occupation is Israel's only major foreign policy problem. And its major barrier to economic integration in the world economy and political diplomatic integration. So this is proven to be the fact that decisions weren't made then, and that the warnings that were already being given then weren't taken seriously. It proves to be more costly for Israel each year that goes by.
Although surely when you say that the occupation is essentially Israel's only foreign policy problem, there must be people there in Jerusalem where you are who reply, don't be under the illusion that if we solve this problem, this would be the end of our troubles. I mean, in other words, that you're surrounded by enemies regardless, and that the Six-Day War illustrates that even if you have like a stable nation-state system around you, instead of this really problematic and unwieldy occupation, you would still have these people who want to destroy your country, right? That must be a common refrain there.
Absolutely, but I think that okay, when I say it's the only foreign policy problem, I mean in terms of relations with the world as a whole, going beyond the Middle East. Clearly, no matter what happens with the occupation with the Palestinians, the Middle East is not going to turn into the nicest neighborhood in the world tomorrow. And just as one very clear example of that, even if we clear up our problem with the Palestinians, 2 houses down the block in Iraq, there's going to be this chaotic situation which is going to remain a major problem for Israel. The Iranian problem isn't going to go away. But it's also true that in terms of Israel's relations with the Arab world, that the Palestinians and the occupation are really the center of that. And, you mentioned before the thing about Wikipedia can't come to any agreed version of what happened here. I think that's also a reflection of the fact that even the diplomatic attempts to solve the problem after 1967 were afflicted by the fact that the two sides didn't realize what they were saying to each other, that they were both really negotiating with themselves. And so a really strong example of this is that in 1968 there was a secret meeting between King Hussein of Jordan and 2 Israeli ministers. And one of the Israeli ministers, Yigal Allon, offered a peace agreement to Jordan in which Israel would give back about 2/3 of the West Bank. And King Hussein said that was wholly unacceptable, that he was willing to make peace, but on the basis of return of the entire West Bank. Allon said, you have to realize that you fought a war and you lost. And Hussein said, yes, we know that. That's why we're willing to accept your existence now within the pre-67 lines. And that really defined something very basic that was going on, is that for the Arab states, at least the Arab leadership, something had changed in 1967, which is they'd realized that they couldn't throw Israel into the sea, that they weren't going to defeat Israel, and their goals changed much more to getting back every last inch that they'd lost in 1967. And in many ways that defines the diplomatic situation up till today. That's really what the Saudi Peace Initiative is about. On the other hand, in Israel,
and again, the Saudi Peace Initiative is. Can you review that? It's the idea that the Arab states would recognize Israel's existence in exchange for a certain set of things, certainly including the return of the land.
Right. Probably the crucial condition in the Saudi Peace Initiative was first proposed in 2002. In recent months, the Arab League has been pushing this idea again, and basically it's an offer of peace and full normalization with Israel in return for a full pullback to the 1967 lines and the establishment of a Palestinian state.
Okay.
So you had a reversal of roles after 1967. Before 1967, the Israeli side would have been eager for normalization based on the lines that existed then. After the war, partly for the reasons that you said, a sense of vulnerability, Israel was saying, well, we want to make peace, but we're not going to go back to those dangerous lines we had before the war. And it was now the Arab side that was saying, well, peace has to be based on those pre-war lines. So the tragedy here also is that even the moderates of each side have really talked at cross purposes, have been writing 2 separate stories about what's been happening ever since 1967. I think that really what Wikipedia needs to do is just to redesign that page in 2 columns so that you can have the 2 stories running down side by side, because any attempt at an agreed story is just going to produce an electronic reenactment of the Middle East crisis.
Yeah. So how? I guess, as you said, this anniversary is being kind of spun in different ways by different ideological contingents within Israel, where you are. Has anything new come to your attention as a result of that, or is it about exactly what you would have predicted? In other words, I would think that an event like this is kind of a light that tends to illuminate the ideological lay of the land, right? Because everybody uses it as an occasion to speak up. Have there been any surprises, or is this just kind of exactly what you would have predicted? And if so, what is that in terms of what the division of opinion is within Israel?
I haven't seen any major conversions, people switching sides. Actually, the last major conversion event in Israel was Ehud Olmert, then Deputy Prime Minister, announcing in 2003 that he was in favor of giving up territory. But since then, there's been no, there haven't been any politicians standing on the sidewalk in shock as a sudden light shone on them from above, and they realize that they've been wrong all their life. Public opinion remains very deeply divided. The two sides, I guess, would be the side on the right that says it's dangerous to give up land. The Arabs don't want just the occupied territories. They want to get rid of us. Anything that we do that weakens ourselves is going to destroy us. At the far right, there are those people who say we have to hold on to every inch because it's what God gave us. But on the left side of the spectrum, there are those who say this is turned into a burden. Continuing to rule over another people is hurting both sides, and that we've got to do everything we possibly can to reach some sort of peace agreement. So that division remains in place. If there's two separate narratives between the Israelis and the Palestinians, I think what you're seeing more and more, even within Israel, is two different ways of describing Israel's own past.
And what's the
was 1967 a great victory, or was it an opportunity squandered?
And how does the percentage of opinion kind of break down if you use that dichotomy of Israeli opinion? I mean, it sounds like a pretty extreme position that you would give up no land whatsoever. I mean, I would assume that's actually a minority opinion within Israel, right?
Yeah, the people who don't want to give up anything are a small minority. Actually, that's a very striking change over the last few years, because if through most of the post-67 period the political division in Israel was between those who said give up something and those who said give up nothing, by the election last year it had become much more a division over how much to give up, with even Benjamin Netanyahu of the Likud saying, well, I'd give up a little bit. No longer claiming that we had to hold on to everything. But there's, I would say, a question of whether the offer you're making is one that's at all realistic. Somebody was talking about just giving up small, isolated enclaves of the West Bank doesn't really have any expectation that the other side is going to accept that. I think that's more spin than it is a practical political plan. The fact that people would present such spin shows that a majority of the Israeli public has, I would say, come to the conclusion that this is not a going enterprise. On the other hand, there's a majority of the Israeli public that feels that it doesn't have a peace partner. So where those two camps overlap in the middle is the group of people, the independent voters, the flip-floppers who have gone back and forth and determined a series of Israeli elections. And those are the people who, if you catch them in a good mood when there's a sign of some sort of peace thing, they say, great, we'll give up land for peace. And if you catch them 15 minutes later when they've just read about something bad, a missile coming over from Gaza, a terror attack, whatever, say they want to destroy us, and even though we'd love to give up something, there's nobody to talk to.
Yeah.
And that really depends a lot on the other side as well in determining which way those people go.
It seems to me that the problem is even kind of worse than that. In other words, one thing you commonly hear, or at least have heard at sometimes is, listen, within both Israel and Palestine, there's a majority of people who want a two-state solution along something like the pre-1967 borders. It's just a question of straightening out the situation on both sides, getting those people in dialogue. But so let's assume, though, that you did solve the problem you described. In other words, that when you say there's not a partner for peace on the other side, in other words, there's not, at the moment, even enough political order to give voice to those moderates within Palestine, assuming there's a critical mass of them, right? But let's assume you solved that problem. And you got together these people.
Boy, you come up with great assumptions.
Well, my source of concern is that even if you assume this, you're in deep trouble for the following reason. Let's suppose you get these two people who are said these two camps that are supposed to exist on both sides that are in favor of an agreement along something like the pre-1967 borders. And then you start asking, well, what do you mean by something like the pre-1967 borders? Well, I would guess that there's very few Palestinians who are thinking that that would not include East Jerusalem, and in fact would not include the Old City, which of course were outside of Israel under the pre-67 borders. I would guess that there are very few Israelis who are thinking that the land they gave back would include the Old City and East Jerusalem, right? And you can always say, well, the total amount of land will be the same, and what we don't give you here, we'll swap. We'll give you this instead. But it's not just a quantitative problem. It has this big qualitative dimension, which is that everyone considers the Old City of Jerusalem sacred, and the Arabs consider East Jerusalem in particular, part of their historical kind of birthright. So am I wrong about that, or isn't it the case that even if you got these two camps together to talk reasonably with one another, they would suddenly discover that they don't actually have enough in common to talk for very long?
I would, there were surveys several years ago. I don't remember the exact date, but there were surveys of Israelis about giving up East Jerusalem. If you just asked Israelis, "Are you willing to give up East Jerusalem?" they'd say no. But then if you broke it down, you say, "Are you willing to give up the northern Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem that Israel annexed in '67?" They, "Oh yeah, sure, give that up." You'd have a majority for giving that up. As you moved closer and closer to the Old City, and particularly to the Western Wall, you got a larger and larger Israeli majority that said we're not willing to give this up. So it's not even. I would focus here. It's not even so much East Jerusalem. It's not even so much the Old City. It's specific holy sites within the Old City that are deal breakers. And certainly,
and can I interject here, Gershom, that if there are people who have not been to Jerusalem, you can't. If you haven't been to Jerusalem, you cannot appreciate how dicey this problem is. In other words, the proximity of the sites that the Jews and the Muslims consider holy, in the Old City. It's the same place, right? I mean, it's like one of them is a foot underneath the other one, right?
Right. Well, even to the extent that most Israelis have a hard time with the idea of giving up the place that Israelis call the Temple Mount, and that Palestinians insist that they must have and call Haram al-Sharif or Al-Aqsa. So when you get to the holy places, you have one of the deal breakers. The other deal breaker, I think the critical deal breaker in all negotiations, has been the Palestinian right of return, the idea that Palestinian refugees from 1948 are demanding, at least in theory, the right to come back to places where they lived in pre-48 Israel. And I think that there is a common element in those two things, because when Israelis insist that they have to have rights to the Temple Mount and reject the Palestinian claim that there's no Jewish connection to that site, in some ways they're talking about Palestinian recognition of Jewish history, recognizing that the Israelis are not imperialists from Europe, they're not colonial settlers, but they're people for whom this is also their homeland. And when the Palestinians talk about the right of return, what they're saying is they're demanding that Israel recognize that Israel's existence led to the Palestinian exodus and to the Palestinians living outside their homeland. So in each case, there's something which is not quantifiable in cash and in acreage. It's a basic demand for recognition by the other side of what's most basic to each side's story. Those issues are certainly much more difficult to resolve. I am not going to go along with those people who say that they're not resolvable at all. I think that proposals have been made that could at least come close to an agreement. I also think that it's worth recognizing that any peace agreement is going to be opposed by the extremists on both sides. Anybody who's looking for an agreement that's going to get 100% acclamation on both sides is, they're waiting for paradise.
Not only that, the extremists are going to start killing people to upset any approach to a solution, and it's going to take, what for human beings is a kind of unnatural amount of restraint to not fall for that bait. On right of return, I actually think that is in principle soluble in the following sense, that if you nominally, it seems the traditional idea has been, well, we'll wait and talk about that at the very end. seems to me, in principle, if you nominally allow right of return, say, yes, it is your right, but then at the very end, start, in effect, buying people out, right? Saying, okay, you have the right to return, but here's this international fund to which America and the Europeans and so have contributed, and we, agree that if you choose not to return, you deserve compensation. Here's a lot of compensation. It seems to me that you would keep the return, you could keep the amount of actual return to such a minimal level that it would not be considered some huge demographic threat by Israel, right? Does that seem plausible to you?
I think that it's possible to keep the actual numbers down. I don't think the compensation is the only part of this, but I do think that to reach a deal with the Palestinians, there would have to be, between Israel and the Palestinians, there would have to be two key elements. One is that at least symbolically, Israel would have to recognize that there was there's some sort of right to return even for a small number of people in order to recognize the Palestinian history. As an Israeli, I would want that to be no more than a very symbolic number of people, because otherwise it would undermine the whole idea of an agreement of a Jewish state next to a Palestinian state. And I think that on the Palestinian side, there has to be some sort of recognition of the Jewish connection to the holy places in the Old City, even if that does not mean actual Israeli control or sovereignty over those spots. In other words, this is not going to be solved simply in quantitative terms. It involves some sort of truth and reconciliation on a national level, recognition of the legitimacy of the other side, of the connection of the other side. In effect, what's really going to be happening here is that in order for the two sides to divide the land, they each have to first recognize that the other side has a connection to the whole of the land and is making a concession of something that belongs to it. And that's the basis for an agreement. And without that basis, I can't see how you're going to get over the emotional hurdles.
Well, do you think, speaking of one approach to that kind of problem, this is not the right of return problem, but the idea that there's an entitlement to the whole of the land, do you think that the original idea of the Old City being an international city is totally dead, or do you think that's actually a good idea, or what?
Well, I wouldn't throw it out, but the devil's in the details on that one. I'd want to know how you would go about who's international, right? who is it that's controlling this area? The Old City is a tiny area, but of course it's of explosive symbolic importance. One proposal that I have seen that I think is a workable idea, a good idea, is declaring that in terms of sovereignty, this was an idea that King Hussein pushed in the 90s, that in terms of sovereignty, the Temple Mount / Haram al-Sharif is under divine sovereignty. It doesn't belong to any nation or country, it belongs to God. But of course, that's declaring who the landlord is, and now you have to decide who the tenant is, who controls it. And so you have to come up with an agreement in which the Palestinian side has actual administration of the Temple Mount. The Jews have actual administration of the Western Wall area next to that. And the agreement covers enough details that you never have to go back to the landlord. So you remove the symbolic issue of sovereignty, essentially recognizing that this is a place that's holy to both religions. But in practice, the area on the Temple Mount is an active Muslim holy place, and in practice, the area next to the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, is the active Jewish holy place, and each holy place would be controlled by the nation that is appropriate.
Yeah, in principle, although, again, for people who haven't been there, the way it is, first of all, from the Jewish point of view, when you confine your zone to the Western Wall, you're actually accepting a tiny fragment of the actual remains of the temple, right, which extend beyond the Western Wall and are directly underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that's part of the problem.
The mount itself.
What's that?
The mount itself, the Temple Mount itself is sacred to, it's not a matter of upstairs or downstairs. The Temple Mount is sacred to both religions. In practice, however, very few Jews are interested in praying on the Temple Mount. The accepted position in Jewish law, although this has been eroded a little bit in the last couple of years by extreme groups, so the accepted position in Jewish law is that Jews are not supposed to set foot on the Temple Mount because of complex reasons inside of the Jewish religion. So Judaism is not oriented toward conducting prayers today in the same place. That's why, to some extent, the issue of ownership can be reduced to a symbolic one. The place where Jews actually pray is at the Western Wall. So you have to find a way of phrasing it so that you're recognizing the theoretical, the abstract claims that overlap, but practically you're dividing the space between the two religions.
So when Ariel Sharon staged that visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that was by conventional interpretation and defiance of Jewish law? Remember, before he was prime minister, he did...
Absolutely.
What's that?
Absolutely.
Huh.
If he'd gone and asked the chief rabbi about that beforehand, he would have been told, you're not supposed to go there.
Wish he had.
Because... Well, yeah. Well, that's one of the demonstrations of the fact that there's such an overlap here between religion and nationalism. Sharon didn't visit the Temple Mount because he wanted to pray there. He visited it because he wanted to assert national control over it. He wanted to show this belongs to the Jews as a nation. He was using. It's a classic situation in which a religious story was transformed into a national story, into a national symbol. And I think the same thing goes on the other side. I mean, if you go into an office in East Jerusalem, you're likely to see an aerial photograph of Al-Aqsa, of Haram al-Sharif, that is to say, of the Temple Mount. It's a religious symbol, but it's also become a symbol of Palestinian independence. People who sit comfortably and try to draw these sharp divisions between religious politics and national politics, I don't know, I mean, it may be appropriate for a talkback section on the internet, but it doesn't have a lot of relation to what's really going on here.
And for Muslims, that mosque, I believe, is the oldest standing mosque, right, in the world.
Well, I would assume that the mosque at the Kaaba in Mecca is older than that. The original mosque of
I'm not sure.
Islam,
I mean, the Kaaba itself certainly is. I'm not sure that. Well, I don't know enough about the Kaaba. I'll stop it there. Maybe a commenter will come up with a correct answer.
But the main thing is that in Islam, Al-Aqsa is considered a holy place of extreme significance. It's less significant than the mosques in Mecca or Medina, but it's considered a central holy spot in Islam. It's considered to be the place where there's a verse in the Quran that describes this night journey taken by Muhammad in Islamic tradition. That is Al-Aqsa, that is the Temple Mount. And from that spot, he, in Islamic belief, he ascended to heaven. He received the commandment of daily prayer. So it's considered a very central holy place. And part of this is that you could look at the Quran itself as an outsider and you'd read that verse and you say, well, that doesn't say anything about Jerusalem. I hear this all the time, and well, it's not true. It doesn't say anything.
Not even clear that it's a reference to the night journey that has come to be described in later tradition. But that's the way religions work.
It doesn't matter whether what that verse means pulled out of context. In the religious, social context of today, Muslims believe that that's Jerusalem, and therefore that's what's important. What's important in Jerusalem is what people believe about it. Historical fact is much less important than the religious fact or the sociological fact of what people believe about Jerusalem, which is also why it's absurd for Muslims to come along and start arguing about whether that's really the site of the temple. Besides the fact that the archaeological evidence is strong that is the site of the temple, it doesn't matter. They're not going to convince Jews that this place isn't holy to them. That's a lost argument before you get started. Right. You have to do is accept that these are the religious beliefs and try to work out a way that the two religions and the two national groups can live with each other.
Mm-hmm. And and
the only reason to think that they might be able to do so is that everybody's so exhausted by war. human beings are creatures who just might try peace when they've exhausted all the other possibilities.
Yeah, but meanwhile, you kind of have this ongoing radicalization that, it's like every stage of the radicalization makes you long for the immediately preceding stage of radicalization, right? It's like, oh, so Al-Qaeda is now infiltrating. Gosh, I wish we had kind of been able to work something out with Hamas, right? And when Hamas came along, it's like, well, Fatah's not looking so bad, It's and that's what worries me is objectively, the groups in power seem to be kind of more and more alarming. But
well, I think that's true. I mean, certainly within Israel that's happened. Once upon a time, Israel thought it was going to reach a deal with Jordan. It didn't. That's what opened up the way for the PLO and Fatah to fill the vacuum. And as you said, when Fatah lost its elections to Hamas, there were Israelis saying, "Oh, why didn't we reach a deal with Abu Mazen? With Fatah, they were so wonderful, and Al Qaeda could make even Hamas look nice." So that's definitely the case. But the question you have to ask yourself is, can you create a dynamic that runs in the opposite direction? Can you create a situation in which moderates are beginning to win political victories, and that legitimizes them in the eyes of their public? What Israelis, I think, seek more than anything else is the opportunity to live without war, to go about their lives without the fear that they're constantly going to be attacked. And a leader who steps closer to that will get support. And the Palestinians want to achieve independence, and a leader who shows concrete gains in that department is going to gain support. So I think it's a mistake to assume that the positive feedback cycle can only operate in one direction.
No, that's true. They never do that forever in history. But I guess one way to put the question, the immediate version of the question, is the following. Right after the election, when Hamas won, although I guess without getting a majority of the vote, but technically won, there
in
were
America,
people.
you wouldn't be familiar with that at all.
Right. We've seen it. We've seen it all too recently. There were people who said, well, this is an opportunity to moderate Hamas. There is this relatively moderate faction in Hamas. There's also this radical faction. It's an opportunity to try to empower the moderates, and don't lose sight of the fact that we have something right now, which is that Hamas, this is again going back to when they won the election now more than a year ago, that Hamas has a reasonable degree of control over the violence that emanates from Gaza, and right now they seem to be abiding by a ceasefire. So let's don't squander this. Okay, let's see if we can work with it. There were people making that argument, not very prominently. I mean the argument wasn't getting a lot of airplay here in America. Certainly, I don't know about Israel, but in any event, that view did not prevail. And now people are saying, well, gosh, some people I would think are starting to say, well, it might, if we had that to do all over again, who knows? Because now, Al-Qaeda's infiltrating Gaza and so on. But it seems to me that moment is gone because there is no longer the degree of order, even within Hamas, that you had then, and it's a much more chaotic situation in the occupied territories generally. So this seems to me to be a case where, at least in this short-term period, the positive feedback cycle, positive being a technical term because it actually being unfortunate, but has played itself out, and we are just now, the situation is just objectively less retrievable than it was, 18 months ago. Am I wrong about that? Or, in other words, don't you think that, what do you think? Do you think there's any chance of kind of salvaging Hamas or what moderation exists or existed within Hamas as part of the kind of reordering of a Palestinian side?
First of all, things have definitely gotten much worse since the pullout from Gaza and since the Hamas victory. The failure to negotiate the pullout from Gaza, the failure to turn over Gaza to a stable government, the boycott of the Hamas government, I think, has shown itself to be to backfire. That instead of forcing Hamas to meet outside conditions, what it did was feed the forces leading to civil war within Gaza, at least among the Palestinians. And now it's very difficult to know who would you negotiate with about Gaza. Nobody seems to control the situation on the ground. Before you can talk about a peace process with Israel, you need to talk about a peace process within the Palestinian side to create a stable government that could negotiate. So yes, the situation is a lot worse. There's more chaos. Gaza looks more and more like a failed state, a place where nobody's in charge, where nobody fixes the sewage when it breaks down. And any political process is also going to have to address a way of creating stable rule inside of Gaza. I wouldn't underestimate how difficult that will be to do. I do think that a political process in itself with Israel has the potential for catalyzing things in a positive direction. In other words, if there's a potential payoff, that may focus people's minds on the Palestinian side better than only using the stick. The carrot may also induce some forces toward political stability.
Okay, well, we've talked for about an hour, and we're at a point where we often are toward the end of a conversation between you and me, with you trying to cheer me up and not entirely succeeding.
Well, I just don't have the luxury of your pessimism.
Yeah, no.
I mean, this is what it really comes down to, Bob, is that from a distance, if I were sitting on your side of the ocean, I could just say, these people in the Middle East, they've screwed things up so badly, they're going to fight forever. Let's switch to the sports channel. But I live here, and the situation is bad, but I'm not willing to write it off. So I'm willing to look for any means possible to start working on improving things.
Actually, I feel much the same way, because I feel that America's national security is tied to a solution to this problem more than I think a lot of Americans realize. So that's one reason I pay attention to it and turn to you for inspiration and uplift, Gershom. And God knows you're doing your best. But on that note, actually there are pessimists in Israel, are there not? I mean, is it not the case that on the right in particular, there's a tendency to say, look, these people are always going to hate us, hunker down, stay strong militarily, this problem will never end, and you're naive to try to actually solve it. Isn't that a view in Israel?
Oh, yeah. And I think that it's partly based on what I would call the ontological view of Jew hatred, is that, the Gentiles hate us. The Arabs are the most recent example of the Gentiles who hate us. The Gentiles always hate us. There's nothing you can do to change that. That's built into the fabric of the universe, and anything else is naivete. But I think that that's ahistorical. It's looking at the world in a mythological sense rather than a practical sense. And I would say that the whole an underlying concept in the creation of a Jewish state was that Jews were going to participate in practical history rather than in mythology. Rather than just praying for the Messiah to come and restore us to our homeland, we were going to be part of the practical, messy, imperfect world of politics in which there are enemies and there are also changes on both sides, and you have to look for the practical ways of doing this. And I think in many ways the right is still living.
Okay. Well, this has been very instructive for me, and I wanted to say, by the way, I mean, you were just talking about people who are too far to your right. I enjoyed your New York Times book review. Sounded like that book you reviewed was a little too far to your left.
I'm not sure
am I right?
Left and right are the right terms here, but I think it was too accepting of simply the Palestinian column in that theoretical Wikipedia article, even though the author portrays his Jewish characters sympathetically. I think he's basically accepted the Palestinian version of history here, and I think that that's fragmentary and incomplete. And if it's allowed to stand by itself, it's somewhat mistaken. And
what is the book again? It was. So it was about the city of Jaffa.
The city
Haifa,
of Jaffa,
right?
which is the
Jaffa.
city, the ancient port city next to which Tel Aviv grew up, and now Jaffa is actually part of Tel Aviv. And I think by choosing to tell the story as he did, the author basically provided a sort of soft, gentrified version of the Palestinian national narrative, and ignored much of the Israeli story. It's well written. As I said, the Jewish characters are not portrayed as devils; they're portrayed sympathetically. But the basic historical line in the book, I think, is essentially the Palestinian narrative.
And in the end, the book either embraced or implied a one-state solution as the goal, or
It
am I
implied that it
imagining
would
that?
be better if at least if the Jews gave up Zionism. And there was a sort of sense of, well, the Jews and Arabs will just intermarry with each other, and everybody will settle down and give up these bothersome national identities. I mean, that's really pie in the sky. I mean, and it's also it's very insulting, I think, both to Jews and Arabs, because what you're coming along and saying is the thing that you consider most important to you, that's basic to your identity, and I think really basic in a way that Westerners don't understand all the time. You should just give that up, because we're beyond that already. We just want to find where the nearest Starbucks is. Squishy.
Okay, well, we'll link to that, to your review of that book. We'll link to your book, The Accidental Empire. We'll link to your American Prospect piece. And I hope your daughter's bat mitzvah went well. Was that? You happy
lovely.
with that?
Lovely, absolutely wonderful. Great time was held by all.
My daughter's ballet recital was yesterday. That's the secular equivalent of, I don't know what that is. That's my family's equivalent of a bat mitzvah, I guess.
Well, it's important to remember that besides arguing politics, there are other things in this world.
That there definitely were yesterday. Okay, well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, see you around.